So in this video, I'm going to go through my favorite, most underrated filmmakers. These are 5 exceptional filmmakers whose work I really love and they deserve a lot more attention. They're not talked about as much, but they deserve to be, and their works are incredible. The first of the underrated filmmakers, I'm going in no particular order, is the Greek filmmaker Tio Angelopoulos. I first discovered Tio, I guess, back in college. I decided to dive into his work by watching his 4-hour film, The Traveling Players. It's a fantastic film, and it's the movie that made me fall in love with him, but I actually wouldn't recommend that as a starting point. Just because it is so long, and all of his films will test your patience, but The Traveling Players will really test your patience. But it is an incredible piece of filmmaking. It's very hypnotic. What Tio does is he, in all of his films, his style is that every single scene he tries to capture in a one-shot. To me, he's kind of like the king of the one-shots, but unlike a lot of other movies that use one-shots, especially in action films, they don't show off. They're not overly choreographed. They're very simple, but there's this wonderful hypnotic element to them. He really he uses one shots to really show the passage of time, and there are some incredible ones in all of his movies, and sometimes you're looking at them and you're not often thinking about the mechanics of his one-shots the way you typically would in, say, a film like Children of Men by Alfonso Cuarón, which is a fantastic movie, and those one-shots are also incredible, but they're not so much driven by action. His one-shots are more driven by emotion. He's trying to capture an entire moment, an entire period in these characters' lives in one breath, and I think he does that really exceptionally well. So again, I did start off diving into his work with The Traveling Players, which might be one of his more well-known films. I feel like when I mention Tio Angelopoulos to other film fans, well, most people haven't heard of him, hence why he's on this list. But most of them have heard of The Traveling Players, except that movie is not easy to get a hold of. But I think a good place to start with Tio would probably be his 1988 film, Landscapes in the Mist. If it's only about 2 hours long, it's not nearly as daunting. I think it's one of his more accessible films, and it will give you a really great sense of whether or not you like his style or not. My 2 favorite films of his, well, I think his ultimate masterpiece is the 1998 film, which won him the Palme d'Or, Eternity and a Day. I actually wrote an article on Eternity and a Day, and I actually got to interview Tio Angelopoulos' good friend and biographer, who sent me this picture. Eternity in a Day is, I think for me, it takes the #1 spot of being the most underrated film of all time. It was one of those rare films that just totally blew me out of the water. I was totally floored by it. It's incredibly powerful and incredibly personal. And then I think his other really great masterpiece is the film he actually made right after that called Weeping Meadows, which is another fantastic film. It was his second to last film. He died in 2012. Interestingly enough, he actually died while making a movie. He was crossing the street and got hit by a motorcyclist and was killed very tragically. Unfortunately, he didn't shoot enough of his final film for somebody else to then come along and finish it for him. But Tio Angelopoulos, not very well known in America. I think he's much more talked about and appreciated in Europe, specifically Greece, but a really just exceptional filmmaker. The second filmmaker on my list who I wanted to talk about is a Canadian named Adam Egoyan. And what separates Adam from the other 5 filmmakers I'm going to be talking about is that Adam was actually nominated for 2 Oscars in 1998. He was nominated for Best Director and Best Adapted Screenplay for his film The Sweet Hereafter. The Sweet Hereafter is actually probably his most famous film. It got quite a bit of attention when it came out. Unlike a lot of his other movies, it got a wide release in the United States. A lot of his movies, they just opened in Canada, and maybe they would eventually make their way down to a few movie theaters in the United States. He shot a lot of his movies in Canada with primarily Canadian actors and actresses, and they typically stayed in Canada, which is really too bad because his movies were so ahead of their time and so innovative. He was looking at and studying media and the way media affects society decades before other more well-known directors were tackling that subject matter. His films are really incredible. I don't think The Sweet Hereafter is actually a good place to start. I think a good place to start with Adam would actually be to go back to the beginning. His very first film, which is one of the most impressive and just immaculately made feature films I have ever seen, is called The Next of Kin from 1984, and he was 24 years old when he wrote and directed this movie, which is crazy impressive when you see the film. It's very short. I believe it's only about 70 minutes long. And it's just this incredibly ingenious and unsettling, but not in a stereotypical horror film way. He tracks the progression of people replacing human contact with images they see on a screen, with media. And he does so in a way where he makes films that they're not quite thrillers. They're kind of set up like thrillers, and you think they're going to turn into a thriller. But they end up being these much more complicated and engrossing character studies. So Next of Kin is a good place to start. And then actually his next two feature films, Family Viewing and Speaking Parts, which he made throughout the 80s, are also really fantastic movies, very underrated. Made for very little money, again, working with a very small production company in Canada, but just really incredible, again, almost thriller-esque character studies. And then in 1994, he made a movie that I actually think is his complete masterpiece, his 1994 film Exotica. And that is just this really brilliantly written and constructed character study about sexuality, and he really takes a hard look at why certain people are attracted to certain things. It's just a really genius piece of writing. I think of all the 5 filmmakers I'm talking about today, he was the best writer. Anyone studying filmmaking should study an Adam Magoyan screenplay, because the way he tricks you or misleads you into thinking one thing, and then there's this brilliant twist or this really unexpected reveal, usually towards the end of his films. They're just incredible pieces of writing. And then in 1997, he had this really big breakthrough hit, The Sweet Hereafter, which stars Ian Holm and a very young Sarah Polley, way before she did Women Talking. I like the film, The Sweet Hereafter. I think it's well made. I don't think it's quite at the same level of all of his earlier work. And then a lot of people say that his post-Sweet Hereafter career, right when you think he would kind of shoot into Hollywood stardom, actually his career kind of took a bit of a nosedive. I've seen a couple of films that he's made after The Sweet Hereafter, and some of them are actually very good. Remember is a very good film with Christopher Plummer, and he also did a film called Felicia's Journey. So those two are exceptional, but yeah, his quality of filmmaking definitely dipped after The Sweet Hereafter, which you wouldn't think. You'd think that that's when he would really kick into gear. But he does have a movie coming out next year, I think, so I'm excited to check that out. Okay, and the third filmmaker I'm going to talk about is the Polish auteur Andrzej Zulawski. Now, one of Andrzej's films has very recently gotten a lot of attention. That's his 1981 film Possession, which I do think is his masterpiece. I think he's made a lot of really great movies, and I'm so glad that people are finally catching up to Possession. And Possession is a great film. I'm so happy that people are now finally coming around to it. But he has a whole other filmography of really, really fantastic movies. I think Possession is his best film, and I think it's also a good place to start. His 1971 film, The Third Part of the Night, is another really impressive debut. It's this very unusual, very grim, but very, very gripping and compelling World War II drama with a little bit of a thriller element thrown in there. There's always a little bit of a thriller element in his movies, although I wouldn't call them thrillers. But his film, I mean, they're unsettling and they're scary and they're always disturbing. They'll get under your skin, but they're also just incredibly emotionally impactful. And of course, what I love about Zulawski the most is the iconic performances that he gets from all of his actors. They're really incredible. And his second feature, which is the 1972 film called The Devil, which should not be confused with the Ken Russell film The Devil, which I think came out in 71. But that's another really interesting period piece. He gets one of the best things about his movies are the performances. Typically, when we talk about great auteurs from Europe, we typically think about their style or their pacing or like their cinematography often comes up. And Zulawski has all that and more with his visual storytelling. But I think what makes his movies so special and memorable is the performances he gets from his actors. Of course, the amazing performance he gets from Isabella Gianni in Possession is really fantastic. And he gets great performances from all of his actors. There's no such thing as a stiff or dull performance in a Zulawski film. But so yeah, I would check out those two. And also he did a French film called The Most Important Thing, Love, from 1975, which is another really fantastic film. It has a lot more in common with Possession, minus the supernatural element. And then I think a lot of people have also heard the story of his attempt to adapt the sci-fi epic novel On the Silver Globe, which he partially finished the film, and then the Polish government shut down productions. He was ordered to actually destroy a lot of the film reels, and he had to smuggle them into his apartment. It's a really incredible story, and there are some great articles and YouTube videos about the making of that film, which eventually an amputated version of it came out in 1988. I have seen the amputated 1988 version of On the Silver Globe. What we have of the film is quite fantastic, but to me it doesn't feel like a whole piece. I think there are definitely gaps in that movie that are felt of what was not filmed. But it is definitely worth checking out. Unfortunately, kind of like Egoyan, throughout the 80s he started to... The quality of his films definitely went down. There's this really interesting dark gothic element to a lot of his earlier work. And then in the 80s, he kind of picked up more of a pop, retro, kind of style and feeling to his movies. It's not quite as compelling. The fourth director who I want to talk about is a South Korean filmmaker. In recent years, a lot more people have become more attuned to all of the excellent cinema that is coming out of South Korea, and I think it's wonderful. I think it's great. I've been watching South Korean films for a while now, and I think it's great that the rest of the world is, or at least American audiences, are finally starting to catch up. And there are a lot of great great South Korean filmmakers whose names get tossed around a lot. But the one who is not mentioned, and I suppose his films are a lot more intimidating than some of these other movies, and that's Lee Chang-dong. He makes such crazy, powerful, raw, human dramas. I mean, when I think of him, I just think of... The word that comes to mind is raw. Visually, his films are very simple and blank. He doesn't have a lot of flair to his style. There's almost never a soundtrack to his movies. What he does is he just takes a setup for a story, and it's gonna sound like something that you don't want to hear anything about. I think his best film, for example, is his 2002 film Oasis. And Oasis is a love story between two young, mentally disabled people. And you might hear that and you might think, oh God, that's going to be some like horrible, exploitative after school special, something like that Sean Penn, I Am Sam movie, or it's not at all. First of all, the acting is truly unbelievable. He gets these two actors to portray mentally handicapped young adults in a way it's scary almost how accurate it is. I mean, you really think you're watching two mentally disabled people, and yeah, it shows them falling in love, and it shows them the rest of society uh, hating what they're doing and just like cringing and discriminating against them, and it's incredibly powerful and just so unflinching. It's such an unflinching look at how a relationship like this would even unfold in real life. I think the film that most people know from Lee Chang-dong is his 2018 film, Burning. As much as I thought that was a fantastic movie, I urge people to go back and check out the rest of his filmography. He hasn't made a lot of movies. He only makes a movie maybe once every like 6 or 7 so years. He waits a long time before he makes a film. But yeah, Oasis is fantastic. And then a couple years after that, he did Secret Sunshine, which is also, I believe, on the Criterion Channel. That's just an incredible roller coaster of emotion film. And then I think my second favorite film of his is the 2010 film Poetry, which again, he's tackling a subject matter that a lot of people don't want to hear about. The film focuses on this older woman in her 60s who just every horrible tragedy that life can throw at you, it's thrown at this woman. It's just an incredibly difficult but so powerful and so absorbing piece of filmmaking. And again, he always gets really wonderful performances from his actors. Nothing like the performances in the Zulawski films. They're very subtle but incredibly powerful. And I think his most underrated movie is he made a film in the 90s called Peppermint Candy, which is a really interesting film. The structure of it is really unusual. It's different chapters in a man's life, but we're getting the chapters in reverse. So we get the final chapter of his life, then we go back one, then we go back one, we go back one. And this is the only filmmaker on this list who I've seen all of his work. His first movie, I think he made it in the 90s, called Green Fish, is probably the only film of his I don't like. That is not a good place to start. A good place to start with Lee Chang-dong, I think, would be Secret Sunshine, because it's a great film, but it's not, the subject matter is not quite as difficult as his other ones. I would actually, you can start there or even start with Burning. And Burning is actually more of a thriller, if anything else. And then I would kind of work your way up to Oasis and Poetry. Okay, the fifth and final director I'm going to talk about today is Sung Ji-ei. And I can't talk about him for too long because actually I've only seen 3 of his movies. But he is a contemporary Japanese filmmaker. I feel like when a lot of people talk about Japanese filmmakers, there were a ton back in the 50s and 60s. People talk about Kurosawa and Kobayashi, who are, absolutely fantastic. But there's actually a lot of really interesting stuff coming out of Japan from the last 20 years. And Sung Ji-ei, I think, from what I've seen so far of that more contemporary Japanese cinema, he is the most brilliant. Just last year, I got to watch his film All About Lily Chow Chow, which is this film from 2001. Just again, totally floored me, totally blew me out of the water. It's this very dark and very heavy depiction of youth in Japan, and it tackles bullying, gangs. It focuses on this Japanese kid. Everyone at his school is just like mean and bullying, and everyone's harassing everyone, and his life is kind of miserable. His one escape from this hell that he lives in at school is this singer, Lily Chow Chow, and she's kind of like his one saving grace. And he goes online to a chat room where he talks to other anonymous Lily Chow Chow fans. And this movie came out way back in 2001, and yet it's way ahead of its time because it's already showing how youths are, you know, if their life at home and if their life in school is miserable enough, they'll just live their lives online where they'll just find all these people who they have commonality with. And again, it's that idea of replacing human interaction with just your computer or the internet, like strangers on the internet. I don't know why more people don't talk about this film. It really is a masterpiece. And then again, I've checked out a few other films of his since then. In 2016, he did a film called A Bride for Rip Van Winkle, which is this really interesting and innovative and totally unpredictable drama about this young woman who has a wedding coming up and she doesn't have any friends, so she has to pay a company of actors to pretend to be her friends and family to attend this wedding. And that's just the setup. A whole bunch of stuff happens after that. I don't want to spoil it, but and then I've also seen another film of his from the 90s called Love Letters, which is a really heartfelt drama, not as powerful as his other two films, but he's made a whole bunch of other movies that, again, they're not all streaming. You can't get all of them online. They're kind of hard to come across, but I can't wait to dive into the rest of his filmography. And that's it. Those are 5 very underrated filmmakers who deserve a lot more attention. Again, it's Tu Angelopoulos, Adam Egoyan, Andrei Zulawski, Lee Chang-dong, and Sunji Iwai. Yeah, let me know in the comment section who your 5 most underrated filmmakers are. Why not?